All right. Um, I'm going to go ahead and do some introductions, and let's just go ahead and get started. Um, so welcome, everybody. Welcome. My name is Shelba Waldron. I'm the Director of Education for USA Gymnastics Safe Sport. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Seeing the Silent Signs and Recognizing the Sexual Trauma in Youth. We are very, very lucky to have Kyle Linton, Dr. Laura Cisco, and Dr. Robin Ortiz with us today representing Our Wave, an online platform for survivors of sexual violence. Before I turn it over to Kyle, because I am not going to at any level try to do the introductions for these amazing people, I want to remind you, I want to put out as a reminder that all reports of sexual abuse or any indications of sexual abuse that you might know will go directly to the Center for Safe Sport at uscenterforsafesport.org and to your local authorities. So with that being said, I'm going to turn the ball over to Kyle and let him get started with his team in this wonderful presentation. Thank you, Kyle.
Great. Thanks, Shelba. First and foremost, we really appreciate you guys allowing us to speak to some of the different individuals that are connected to your organization. And we really wanted to take some time today and bring together some interesting people who could sort of talk about some of the areas that we're directly involved with Our Wave. So specifically, by means of quick introduction, my name is Kyle Linton, and I'm the Executive Director of Our Wave. And Our Wave is a nonprofit that is specifically focused on creating an online platform for survivors of sexual violence to safely and anonymously share their story. And today is not as specifically about the Our Wave platform, but we wanted to bring together some of the different individuals on our team to share some more information with you in this presentation and to discuss some of the topics that could be beneficial. I'll introduce them in just a second, but by means of quick housekeeping, obviously we're leveraging Zoom. We've got the chat function open at all times. So the general plan for us is that we're going to run through the presentation, and then at the end, if you will send your questions to all panelists via the chat, I will review those questions, I will synthesize them, and we'll answer them to the best of our ability. Separately, if there are individual areas that we need to respond to, and you want to reach out to us privately, our personal emails will be included at the bottom, as well as our Twitters and other things if you want to live tweet this or whatever else. So right before I jump into introductions, the last thing that I will say is we recognize that some of this content can be a little bit sensitive. So if people need to take a step away or sort of to take a minute, we would welcome you to do so. And obviously Laura and Dr. Ortiz can talk about that as well. So by means of quick introduction, and I'm going to get out of the way and simply field questions. So I started, by bios, I started Our Wave a few years ago after someone that I was close with directly experienced sexual violence. And I wanted to help create a place where survivors of sexual violence could safely and anonymously share their stories. And so I ended up pulling together a bunch of different people, including Laura, to help create that location and sort of leverage her background combined with sort of my technology expertise to create something that could create an impact. And specifically, I'm going to read off sort of the dry bio and then briefly talk about Laura. But Laura is a PhD prepared mental health nurse, sexual assault nurse examiner, and current fellow in the National Clinician Scholars Program. She has expertise in gender-based violence and trauma recovery and has a passion for amplifying the voices of sexual violence survivors and serves as the Director of Research and Evaluation for Our Wave. And Dr. Robin Ortiz is an MD, a physician for adults and children, and she completed her residency at Johns Hopkins in both internal medicine and pediatrics, and is currently a fellow in the National Clinicians Scholars Program. Her areas of focus are identifying the impacts of childhood adversity across the lifespan and building resilient families and communities. And on a quick personal note, before I hand it off to Laura, these are two amazing women I've had the pleasure of working with. They're much more knowledgeable in these topic areas than I am. And I'm really lucky to be able to work with both of them. So I'm going to hand it off to Laura, direct any and all questions to me, and I'll help field them, and we'll do our best to address any and all of these areas that you guys present to us. So take it away, Laura.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kyle. So we want to start with just a disclosure. While you heard Robert and I's very extensive backgrounds on the topic and our affiliations with many organizations, we are representing only ourselves for this presentation, and we have no formal disclosures to speak of, but it is important to know, however, that although I am a nurse and Rob is a physician, this presentation is meant to deliver general information and is not meant to provide medical advice. And so if you have any personal stories or personal issues, we will give some information for various supports, resources, hotlines, people that you can reach to speak more specifically about certain scenarios that you may be going through in your personal life. And so I wanted to start this presentation with a personal reflection. And I think this is really important because we know we're going to be talking about trauma today. And when we're talking about trauma, it can bring up a lot of different thoughts and emotions. So I'm going to ask you to be reflecting on these questions just in your own head. You can feel free to write them down, but you will not be asked to share these in any way. So to start, in your own words, what do you think trauma means? What does it mean to you? Can you think of some examples that you've seen or heard about? And what are some contexts in which you've heard this term be used before? So the next thing I'd like you to think about is, why might trauma be a controversial term or idea? And so what disagreements might you have heard or might you expect when we discuss trauma in our communities? And finally, does this term evoke any emotional responses in you that you think might be useful to be aware of when you discuss this with other people? And this is particularly important because we will be talking about trauma a lot today. Great. So we want to get a sense of who is in the room. And so in light of that, I'd like you to, if you're willing, just write a brief sentence of maybe who you are or why you might want to attend this webinar today. And you can put this in our panelist chat, and Kyle will report to me just more about what people are doing here, what their expertise is, or maybe just what they're interested in learning about today.
And quick housekeeping note, if you don't know how to leverage it, the chat is in most windows, it's in the bottom right corner, and then you can select who it's being sent to. And if you send it to all panelists, I can address it and sort of respond. And there's no pressure to respond at all, but we'd love to sort of just see what the different backgrounds are and how we can best sort of cater the content that we put together in this presentation. Awesome. Starting to see some different ones come in. All right. So we've got a couple different people, a couple different gymnast coaches. We've got sports psychologists represented here working with young gymnasts. We have an attorney that has a young gymnast herself. Gym owners, a mom of teenage gymnasts. Goodness, they're starting to pour in now. Sort of a broad spectrum, different individuals who represent different areas that support sexual assault and sexual violence survivors. Office managers listed here, gym owner and coach, people who have worked with USA Gymnastics for years. We've got a pretty broad spectrum of people. Awesome. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining, and hope that helps, Laura.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And this makes me really excited to really get people who are thinking about sports related trauma probably from a lot of different angles. And so for some of you, some of these things might be review, but I'm really hoping that everyone can really pull something out of this presentation today that can be helpful in helping us create a community of prevention. And so It's important to note that everyone can really be someone that can help us build this community. Everyone can really be trauma informed, and everybody has an important role to play. In order to do that, Dr. Ortiz and I decided to try to modify a framework that SAMHSA, a national organization focused on substance abuse and mental health concerns, created to create trauma-informed communities and trauma-informed care. So the first step that we'll be going through today is to realize the widespread impact of trauma and how it manifests in sport environments. The next step is going to be to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in youth, families, and staff. The next is going to be to respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into our procedures and daily practices. We then can resist re-victimization and re-traumatization by creating a culture of safety and healing. And then ultimately reflect on our own personal feelings and biases to ultimately create a community of prevention. So we're going to start with realize. And so we framed our presentation today based on these R's. So the first step is to realize the widespread impact of trauma and how it manifests in sport environments. So first, it's important to note, what is trauma? So when we think about how trauma is defined, there are 3 E's. The first is the event. And so this can be very obvious because we know events and circumstances can cause trauma. But ultimately, what really determines whether or not an event is traumatic is how individuals experience the event. And so this is important to note because 2 people might experience the same event, but might have different experiences and therefore different impacts. And so that leads us to the 3rd E, which is the impacts or the effects. And so that can include adverse physical, social, emotional, or spiritual consequences. And again, depending on the person, these things can manifest differently. So it's really important to note the intersection of identity and trauma, because we know that identity is closely related to trauma vulnerability, but also subsequent processing. So it's also important to note that the historical, personal, and community traumas individuals may experience outside of sports-related trauma can also compound the way they process their abuse experiences if they experience it in the sports environment. And so today, for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be focusing on trauma and abuse in youth sports. And this can include a variety of things. It can be physical abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, emotional or psychological abuse. And this can occur through the actions of coaches, other adults, and even through different peers and different teammates. And so it's important to note that unfortunately anyone can really be the ones that are perpetrating these events, and also anyone can be victims or survivors of these events. And so just to give us a starting point, there was a 2015 study in the UK that was one of the first of its kind to really measure the emotional abuse in young athletes. And so it's been estimated that 75% of young athletes in organized sports have experienced some sort of psychological or emotional abuse at some point in their careers. And that sounds really high, and unfortunately it is. And the International Olympic Committee really emphasized that this can be a gateway for other forms of non-accidental violence. So that's why emotional abuse can't be ignored. In terms of sexual violence specifically, because this is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and that is our focus for today's presentation, we know that 14 to 29% of children in sports experience sexual violence. And this can range from sexual harassment all the way to sexual assault. And so just to get us all on the same page with the different types of violence, I'm going to be defining some key terms. So the first one is sexual harassment, which is defined by the International Olympic Committee as any unwanted or unwelcome contact of sexual nature, whether it's verbal, nonverbal, or physical. And then there's also sexual abuse, which is defined as any conduct of sexual nature, whether non-contact, contact, or penetrative, where consent is coerced, manipulated, or is just, or cannot be given. And so why might athletes be at higher risk? Because you see the numbers and they really are startling. And so the first thing that's important to note is that athletics can provide this social bubble where abusive behavior can be normalized. For example, if a trainer is frequently calling athletes names or saying insulting things or saying inappropriate jokes, it can grow to feel normal. And then it can really be difficult for someone to step up and report these things. The next is that parents can really trust coaches as experts because coaches in their own rights are experts, but this can be exploited or taken advantage of. We also know that there's this generally accepted physical contact that can occur between trainers or coaches as a part of training. And some of this is necessary to do some adjustments and corrections. And so that can make it really difficult for particularly youth to at first recognize when abuse is happening. There also is extensive time spent with coaches and athletes and different trainers and athletes. There's this idea of team sacredness and loyalty, and this can contribute to some fears of potentially betraying the team or negatively impacting the team dynamic by speaking out against these things. And then finally, there's a longitudinal or developmental aspect of sports training that makes sports a really beautiful place to learn and grow. But it also can be a place where abusers can take advantage of that, building that really strong relationship and trust that can be built over the years. And so there are some particular high-risk areas for abuse that's important to know. And like I said before, really anyone can be a perpetrator of violence, but it is important to note that studies do show that at the lower levels of competition, abuse is actually more oftenly perpetrated by teammates or peers, whereas you get higher with competition at higher levels, they are more often than not coaches. And I say this not to put anyone to feel defensive or to feel like you're being targeted, but it's just information that's good to know. And I think we can really flip that on its head and say, how can these teammates who have a lot of leverage when kids are young, and how can these coaches who might have some leverage as people get older in the sport, how can we really use those really important people to our advantage to build a community of prevention? And so as parents, it's important to be aware of just these areas that might be considered high risk. And so that can be different social situations where youth are no longer in the sports setting. It could be at a parent's house or another teammate's house. Locker rooms where people are frequently changing or doing private things, cars, so driving to and from practice can be a high-risk area, and also residential sports trips, because we know that people are more likely to perpetrate when they are in a situation that's separate from the club or the area where they work and where they can really isolate their survivors or victims. So like I said, while some characteristics of youth sports may make children more vulnerable to abuse, we also can leverage elements of these spaces to create a culture of prevention and healing. And that's really our goal today.
And so in order to do that, we first must all collectively as a community at every level recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in youth, families, and staff. I hate to go back to the disclosure, but this is really important that the variety of experiences is too dynamic for us to be able to capture in one presentation, and can especially impact individual families and individual victims, as well as those involved in situations such as witnesses, etc., as part of a community, to really be able to identify if this information is specific to them. So as a physician, and Laura as a nurse, and as researchers, it's really important for us to emphasize we encourage you to take this information as education and bring it back to your healthcare professionals or those that are entrusted in your community in and outside the sport, rather than taking our words as specific advice. However, we really feel strongly about advocating from a source of education, and that's what we intend to do today. And I'd like to start by educating on the recognition of the signs and symptoms. So indicators of possible abuse in sport So when this might be occurring in the moment, one might notice that individual athletes may be missing or avoiding practice, having frequent illness, whether or not the illness is verified to be something substantial that needs treatment, or it's symptomatic illness like headaches or stomach aches, loss of interest in a sport, withdrawal from the sport or from practice or from peers or teammates, performing significantly below known ability at baseline, and suddenly wanting to drop out. Now I'm going to pause here. You'll probably hear me say it a few times. So what's most important is the change in behavior. So it might be something that there's a period of time in development where an adolescent is sort of opposed to the frequency of practice of a sport or the rigor, or wants to spend more time with friends instead of going to practice. These are normal obstacles for young athletes and developing athletes. But what I'm specifically interested in emphasizing is any change that would be abnormal for a normal individual of that age, or for that specific individual based on their previous behavior. That's when these kinds of things that I point out here and the symptoms I will share should be alarming. So grooming behavior is defined in the sexual assault and violence literature as grooming being when someone builds a relationship, trust, and emotional connection with a young person or their family with the potential conscious or unconscious intent to manipulate, exploit, or abuse them. These behaviors can involve targeting the victim, which there's a lot of controversy in the literature interested in researching how this happens, and then building a sense of trust with not only the individual, but the community around. So the team, the institution, and perhaps the family or friends of the individual. And then developing isolation and initiating an intention of sexual abuse and securing secrecy. So some examples of this may be, as Laura alluded to, a coach, or again, not to pin coaches, this can be anybody, even a family member, a friend, who's suddenly interested in isolating only that individual to and from workout practices, etc., or going on distance competition trips where the room is shared only by those individuals alone. These are just examples, again, as Laura said, not to instigate that anyone in particular is at fault here, just trying to supply some information that comes from the literature on these sources. But more so as a pediatrician, although I also do see adults, so I see how this develops into adulthood, I want to emphasize from a pediatric standpoint that although the experiences Laura identified can be experienced by adults and children in a similar way, meaning a commonly stressful environment. It would be stressful or traumatic to be raped, whether you're a child or an adult. But what's inherently different is that often children display symptoms differently. And an example of this may be not even necessarily sexual violence, but any stressor could trigger in an adult situation depression. I imagine with the coronavirus going on right now, a lot of us being in isolation are feeling sad and lonely. However, for children, they may actually manifest those same sensations or feelings as agitation, and it might not be easy to recognize as an adult that this is indeed depression. Similarly, anxiety in adults might not look the same in children, where children might actually lack desire to engage in things they enjoyed prior, but actually out of a sense of fear rather than a sense of apathy, that they're scared to go out with their friends or scared to go to practice. So just some examples, again, to keep in mind. So point blank, youth can react to trauma in many ways: physical, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral. And we will go through these, but what is important is that it differs by age. Regardless, what the underlying point here is, as a parent or a caregiver, I just use parenting because this is a direct quote from a governmental organization that we'll reference at the end. Parenting a traumatized child may require a shift from seeing, quote, a bad kid to seeing a kid who had bad things happen. As the examples I will give, you may say, oh, that's sort of just bad behavior. And that may or may not be the case depending on the circumstances. So in young children, we tend to see irritability or fussiness, particularly being inconsolable, frequent tantrums, clinginess, to a caregiver, activity levels differing from peers, repeated traumatic events in play or conversation. So this is a very important one. If it's noted that a child is suddenly interested in playing by showing private parts to another child or acting out a scenario that it's unclear where the origins may have come from, it could be a red flag that something is happening. Importantly, again, emphasizing, please see your healthcare provider, because some of that exploration is normal with children as they develop and learn about their bodies, and some is inappropriate. And there's no point on putting the pressure on yourselves in the community, no matter what your role is, to identify that, but rather to be aware so it can be raised to the attention of a professional. And then there's delayed milestones. And this, again, is a change in behavior as children reach their milestones at different ages, depending on them. So for example, a child who may have reached potty training abilities by age 3, then at age 12 suddenly starts wetting the bed at night, may be an indicator of stress or trauma. None of these are specific to sexual violence, as again, every individual experiences a traumatic or stressful event totally differently, but in general could be stressor, whether from sexual violence or other. School-age children may have difficulty in school, and not only just getting more frequent calls from teachers or struggling in class, but actually just noticing suddenly not going to school, frequent absences, or getting in trouble more often, with the underlying principle being concentration and attention. Withdrawing in class or with peers, becoming frequently tearful. There's this fancy word up there, somatization, which just means internalization of feelings that come up as physical manifestations. So stomach aches, headaches. Again, emphasizing, children get stomach aches, children get headaches. They can have them for other reasons, like struggling to see and the board can cause a headache. But if this is a new symptom or it's happening without clear history from the child, or the child's too young to explain, it's a time to seek help. Talking often of scary feelings. This may happen at bedtime. It's normal for children to be scared of the dark or think boogeyman is in the closet, but if that's new, or the child is suddenly unable to sleep at all without being with the parent, again, depending on the age, it can be normal. If that's new, it's scary. And then difficulty concentrating and transitioning tasks, and new fights or trouble at school or practice that wasn't there before. So this can be applied not only in the school environment, but the sport environment as well. And then there's teens, where the behaviors can be all over the map to begin with, developmentally and appropriately normal, but particularly if there's a new change in communicating extreme. So for example, a teen may suddenly be talking about a trauma as if it's normal. Bragging about the incident, for example, with the peers, and an actual unconscious coping effort to normalize the circumstance. However, it could go in the opposite direction, where one suddenly begins denying it entirely, whereas a week or so, some amount of time before, had admitted or explained that the situation happened. So changes in communication about a story or generalized behavior. Defiance against rules or talking back, feeling tired all the time, sleeping more than peers, nightmares, and risky behavior, hypersexuality, and using substances. Again, unfortunately, can be, I don't want to say normal, because it's not something we want our children to go through, but can be seen commonly in adolescents, even those who have not experienced sexual or other trauma. However, if it's new, if it's concerning, if it's difficult to manage, you must seek help or raise attention to it. Fighting the desire suddenly to not spend time with peers or friends, not because one is in quarantine, but because they really genuinely don't want to, or running away or trouble with the law that was not happening before.
And so now we're going to talk about responding. And so we want to respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into procedures and our daily practices. And so the most important things you can do to respond, or to create an environment where people might even disclose their experiences to you, is to create this environment where situations can be shared without judgment. And that can be really difficult for us to do, but really it's trying to create a space where open communication is encouraged and feelings can be shared. We also want to not be afraid to ask questions or to seek help if you notice any red flags. We're going to be talking a lot about red flags today, and so if you start to recognize something or something doesn't quite feel right, it's worth asking. And so it's also important to have conversations about boundaries with your child early, even if you don't think anything is happening. And that can be uncomfortable for parents and really anyone to talk about boundaries. But what you can do is really model boundaries at home and really show children that they have the right to their own body and their own space. So an example that I like to give, if a parent is frequently like tickling their kid and their kid really doesn't like it and says stop, respecting their boundary and stopping and modeling the behavior that they have the right to autonomy over their body can be a really helpful way to really show your child what boundaries look like and how they can be respected. And ultimately, if someone discloses to you, it's important to really reassure them that it is not their fault, no matter what. And so we know people can respond to trauma differently. And so there are two main response patterns. And I bring these up because I think we're really used to seeing this first response pattern, which is the expressed response pattern. So this is often the response pattern we feel the most comfortable with. So if someone discloses a trauma to us and they're really fearful or angry or crying, sobbing, feeling restless, that's very obvious to us that they're in distress. And so we almost are feeling like we can believe them more because clearly they're very upset about this thing. But it's also important to really remember that there's another response pattern to trauma, and that's the controlled response pattern. And so feelings can really seem masked or hidden. Potentially the child could talk about a situation like very straight-faced without a lot of emotion. You also might even experience from the child some inappropriate laughter as they tell about the story because it makes them feel so uncomfortable. And so unfortunately, those children are the ones that often do not get believed because they don't have the same response pattern that we're comfortable with and that we're used to. But on either side of the spectrum, both of their responses are normal, and they're a normal response to trauma and how people can process. And so I wanted to, because my passion really is amplifying the voices of survivors who've experienced these things, I wanted to pull some quotes from the literature that came from individuals who experienced sports-related abuse to really give a sense of what their experience was like trying to disclose. So the first quote says, "I thought I could handle this myself. I'm a strong person. This is not a problem." And so survivors often struggle with this idea of strength. And what does strength mean? And does strength mean that I can do this all on my own? And does seeking help really make me weak? And so that's something that I think a lot of survivors, both youth and adults, struggle with. And so it's important to recognize if our children or our teens are not disclosing these things to us right away, that could be a reason. They might be afraid to be a burden. They might be afraid of the consequences or the events that might follow, and they might want to handle it themselves. Someone else said, "I felt guilt. I was complicit." And this individual specifically was a man that was abused by another man. And so there were also some questions about his own sexuality, not wanting to bring that to the table and really talk about that. Also being confused about feelings when you really trust someone and when someone really does groom you to make you feel special and loved and cared for, it can be really confusing what your role is in the situation. But again, it's really important to emphasize that abuse is not okay and that no matter what happened, it is not the child's fault. And then finally, I thought this was a pretty powerful quote that silence assists abusers. It's the one thing they require. They need silence. And so this really highlights the importance of disclosure and why we really need to encourage that with our kids. And so as parents, as professionals, as individuals who are in the sports community, we know that we form these very strong bonds with kids. I can reflect to my soccer coach and the things that I told her compared to what I told my parents in high school was like totally different. But she was an incredibly positive role model for me. And I probably would have disclosed more things to her than my parents. So especially being in the sports community, you might get some of these disclosures because people feel like they can trust you. And so I want to provide a brief framework for how you might respond to these disclosures. So the first is to listen, which seems really obvious. But when someone discloses trauma to us, it can make us feel a lot of emotions: anger, fear, sadness, and it might be really, might want to really quickly jump in and ask a lot of questions. And so really, it's important for us to think, listen first, speak second. and really allow the child to lead the conversation and let them talk until they're finished. While we might need to ask some questions, try to really question your motivations of why are you asking these questions? Because when this does get reported, because that's the take-home message here, you will need to report this, they're gonna be asked a lot of questions. So if you can really hold space and listen, that's really important. And just recognize that silence is okay, and tell the child that you're glad that they told you, because they might be worried that they might get in trouble for telling this information. Next is to believe. It's really easy for us to write off children's behavior as attention seeking, but it's really important to clearly say that you believe them and it's not their fault. That is something that we know with the literature. The first person that you tell about your trauma or your abuse has a significant impact on your healing long term based on their responses. And then support. And so that can be different for different kids, different teens. Really, it's important to ask, how can I be helpful? And then when this is all said and done, to tactfully follow up with them and just let them know that you're thinking of them and you're here if they need anything. And finally, most importantly, it's really important to say that you do not need to be a trauma professional, and you're not expected to be a trauma professional. We all have different strengths and different trainings. And so although we don't want to jump right into problem solving mode and make the child feel afraid or that they're not being heard, we do really need to be transparent about what we're going to do with this information. And so if you do expect child abuse or you suspect it, it is your responsibility to report for the safety of the child and others. But we know with survivors of violence, power and control and autonomy can be really huge in the healing process. So it's important to also think about what autonomy can you give the child, since unfortunately they can't have the autonomy of whether or not you report, but they might have the autonomy to make the decision. Do they take a break from the sport? Do they miss the next day of school? Do they get to pick what they have for dinner that night? Even small choices and decisions can be really helpful for survivors to regain that sense of normalcy and control. And so it's important to emphasize, and I can go into a whole lecture on this because this is really my passion, but for the purposes of this, I just want to emphasize that abuse can happen, and unfortunately it does happen. And for individuals that experience it, particularly, I'm not sure if there's any survivors in the audience, but there can be moments where you can really feel stuck and overwhelmed, and like there may be nowhere to turn or no positive things to come in your future. We can just get in those ruts. And so I think it's important to mention that healing, while it's not a linear process and while it takes a lot of work, it is possible.
So I just want to say before we go into some of the last R's here of this model, I know that we have about 5-10 minutes and we will be taking questions at the end, but the resist is really the collective community's response after when something is disclosed or when something is suspected. And so repeat victimization as well as re-traumatization is what we want to resist to create a culture of safety and healing. The first step to creating an environment of safety is to seek help when you observe red flags and report abuse when you suspect it. As Laura said, we do not expect anyone to walk away from this as an expert, though some of you already are and have that training. It's just important to feel comfortable at any level of concern to seek help and to know where to go, which is what we want to help provide today. We know that if something is disclosed, the process of reporting can be very scary. There's lack of procedures for reporting abuse. There can be abuse viewed as an issue by the individual as opposed to the institution. There's a closed nature to some institutions. There's a belief system surrounding some institutions, such as things can't happen here, that would be that scary or bad. And there's also internal feelings of the person who is witness or the person disclosing or the person reporting, such as shame, self-blame, fears, fears of not being able to help, or even fears of not being believed. And then additional fear of, did I do something? Did I do something to put a child in harm's way? And that can be overcome. These barriers can be importantly overcome. For example, lack of procedures for reporting, knowing where the resources are, which we will try to address today, but there are so many out there. The institutional barriers can be addressed by going outside to unbiased institutions, or at least as various institutions if there's concerns that one may be more biased to a certain circumstance than another. And lastly, recognizing that there are institutions out there supportive of all parties and really trying to help people who are struggling with the abuse process themselves or the reporting to be supported. Number one, if you're unsure, ask. And one opportunity to do that is free and confidential through the National Sexual Assault Hotline. Anybody can call. Need not be a victim or even a witness. It can be somebody who has a simple question or concern. And the phone number is there. There's a chat option online. And the network is actually known as the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, but any related concerns can be directed here, and there is a website. Again, full disclosure, Lauren or I are associated with these organizations we mentioned. We just wanted to pull some resources for you. And then moving into the actual reporting, we know that our wonderful partner organizations today who invited us here today have their own mechanisms on their website, which you can see on the panel to the right. However, there are other opportunities, and this need not be specific to sexual abuse cases. Childwelfare.gov, if you go to the bottom of the page, has a how to report child abuse or neglect, which covers all domains of childhood adversity and trauma. And this is supported by the government, by the organizations I listed there. There's specific reporting practices broken down by state that can be found on this website, but remember, you can always go to your local healthcare provider for help. Now, I'm biased, and I'd like to say that they are unbiased and they're to really just help you in the moment. But of course, there's always opportunity to seek additional layers of support and not just one. Now we want to avoid re-traumatization. And what is that? It's a reaction of traumatic responses whenever individuals are exposed to their traumatic histories or triggers that may remind them consciously or unconsciously without sufficient tools. Key there, without sufficient tools or support to manage those emotional, behavioral, and physical reactions. So what we want to do is instill tools, and what I want to do in this lecture is emphasize that you are the tools, the adults out there, the peers out there. The most important protective factor for any child who has experienced, is currently experiencing, or will experience trauma is a supportive relationship. And that's supportive, healthy relationship with appropriate boundaries, but also appropriate listening. The comments that Laura outlined is what we're looking for in this relationship. And then if the child has multiples of those in a community, even better. Not only are they more likely to disclose if something traumatic is happening, but they're way more likely to rebound from it and heal. So how can you avoid that re-traumatization for your children? Create an environment free from judgment and blame, as we talked about, trying to give them choices when possible, recognizing safety and reporting may come first, listening first, speaking second, being transparent and consistent, allowing them to discuss what they may think is best for their well-being and healing. Offering and normalizing professional help is huge. So having them feel comfortable that it's okay to seek help outside of those individuals that are close and known to the child, and avoid physical punishment especially, but trying to find solutions instead by partnership and communication at all times when possible. In order to take good care of your child, though, you must take good care of yourself first. And secondary trauma is a real thing. It's defined as the emotional duress that results when an individual hears the firsthand trauma of another. And this can be particularly harmful when it's somebody that's close to you that you care about and you're feeling those shame and guilt feelings. So realize, respond, resist in your own responses to this secondary trauma. We can only support and give care to others in a community or individuals from a resilient and full well.
And so finally, we're going to close our presentation with an R that we added that's additional from what SAMHSA had originally proposed. And I think it's really important that we reflect on our own personal feelings and biases to create a community of prevention. And so it's important to do, like we did in the beginning of this presentation, a mental check-in with yourself. We are the products of our own experiences and our own traumas. And so being aware of this and how it might influence our reactions to disclosures and things of this nature is incredibly critical. It's also important to be aware of our biases. We often think we don't have any, and unfortunately, most of us, if not all of us, have some sort of bias. And so some ways to do a mental check-in might be asking yourself some questions like, when you think of sexual abuse in sports, what are the first things that come to your head? Depending on what those might be, it might reveal something to you about something that you might have internally in your perception of how you think about it. It's also important to recognize that abuse can occur in any sport and crosses socioeconomic, ethnic, and cultural lines. And so often people might think, not in my club or not in my neighborhood. And while this might be protective to help us not be so fearful of the environment around us, and the world can be really scary, they also can contribute to a culture of denial where predators and perpetrators can be protected. So ultimately, we want to leverage all of the wonderful strengths of sports to build a resilient community. And so first, we can try to create a culture of safety. This is physical safety, but also psychological safety, where people can share their feelings and experiences openly. We also want to build trust within our teams and within our coaching staff to really be able to give voice to concerns as they arise. We also want to empower our children and our athletes to speak up when something doesn't feel right and give them the tools to really know who to go to for help. We also want to collaborate. This is not a coach problem or a trainer problem or an athlete problem. This is a human problem. And so we need to collaborate with all stakeholders, both in the gymnastics community, but also in the broader sport community to really address this issue head on. We also want to provide some opportunities for peer support for people who are struggling, and also always keep in mind history, gender, and culture, because we know individuals of certain groups are disproportionately affected by violence and also by some of the consequences and manifestations of not being believed and not being supported. And so finally, we have some resources, and Robin will tell you more about that.
So I want to emphasize, because some of these are medically specific, that it may come up in a question. I don't know if it has, but I thought to mention there are mandated reporters, and then there's this general concept that any and everyone who interacts with children should report. It varies often by state. Sometimes laws are changing, so by no means do I want to make claims here of who those are. And so I would rather say that any and everyone who has any concerns, seek one of these organizations to guide them to what best next to do. There are like parent specific, but there are also resources on here for learning. So very quickly, we know the Center for Safe Sport, that is the parent organization for you guys all to go to. There's also child advocacy hotlines like the National Child Abuse Hotline, Child Help. They also have a website. The National Parent Hotline is a really good one for those uninterested in talking specifically about abuse, but looking for more guidance or information. For more reading on this topic, the AAP, I am biased as a pediatrician, but they also serve parents and families, not just physicians or even clinicians or healthcare providers. And they have some specifics there, even on sexual violence in sports. The Resilience Project is one of their campaigns working to build resilience after trauma. The Child Welfare Information Getaway is that government-sponsored organization to provide you with reporting resources. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a wealth of literature to read about this. And then RAIN, I mentioned prior, as that hotline that one could call.
And so this is also a quick plug to circle back to the organization that I'm a part of and Kyle's a part of, called Our Wave. And so while we recognize that this is focused on children and youth, and so unfortunately, because of reporting needs, our platform is not designed for anyone under the age of 18, but we know that there might be some people in the audience who, talking about these things, might have brought up some feelings or thoughts about your own personal trauma, particularly sexual trauma that you might have experienced. And so we really just want to let you all know that our platform is available at www.ourwave.org. If nothing else, to check it out and to learn more about the experiences of survivors. And we really aim to build a community of hope and healing. And so I want to end, and I know we ran a little bit over time. I want to provide some time for questions, but I also want to provide some time for reflection to really model what we are asking you all to do in terms of these R's. And so I like to end my presentations with these exercise called head, heart, hand. And so with this, I would ask anyone who's still tuned in to send a message to our panelists responding to any of these three things. So for head, something that you learned from this presentation. For heart, something that you felt as a result of this presentation. And for hand, something you're going to do with this information. And so this is going to be private. Just the panelists will see this. We won't be sharing these out loud, but just so we can get a sense of what you took from this presentation and how we might be able to make it better if we ever do this again. And if you have any questions, this is our contact information. And so any questions that we are not able to address due to time constraints today, we will be happy to respond to them via email if we're able. And if not, we will direct you to resources to better answer your questions. And so with that, if you are putting in your reflections, that's great. If you also have any questions, you can also feel free to send that to the panelist channel, and Kyle will have a lot to sift through, but he's going to be fielding most of those questions, and Dr. Ortiz and I will be responding as needed. So please feel free to put questions or to put your reflection response in the all panelists channel.
This is Robin Ortiz. I just really want to thank everyone out there for listening. We welcome all questions, as Laura said. We may not have the answers, but we welcome it. We welcome conversation around this very sensitive topic. If there's things we can't talk about, we hope that we can direct you to where you can, but we will be very honest with you if we can't. And I'm going to put the references up here while we talk about questions so that people can go look to the literature that we reference, keeping in mind it's impossible for us to list everything, so we understand there may be even better ones out there, and we welcome you to share those as well.
Absolutely. And just to, I mean, these guys have already said everything, but thank you to everyone. First of all, USA Gymnastics for letting us put this on. Second of all, I am actively fielding questions, and we're seeing a lot of feedback from different people. We will definitely work with Shelba to disseminate this presentation and other mediums and sort of coordinate the best way to do that, as we don't specifically have your sort of information to disseminate that. But if you guys do have questions, we can definitely run over just a little bit or answer things personally. So please feel free, anything and everything, to reach out to us via the chat feed. We'll give it just a couple minutes and we'll aggregate those and answer them as they come. One real quick question, and maybe as they keep coming in, one question that was asked is, do you see a difference in reporting and believing between the genders? So Laura and Robin, do you have thoughts on that front?
Yeah, so I have some thoughts on that. And so I don't quite know if there's difference in believing, but I do know that there is some gender differences in reporting and why people might not report. So I know that more often than not, people who identify as men often don't report these experiences when they feel that it jeopardizes their masculinity. So particularly if there's a male perpetrator or anything like that. And we know that women often don't report victimization when they feel like it doesn't fit the classic stereotypical rape or sexual assault scenario that they see on TV. And so that's not exactly the answer to that question. So we know that there are gender differences. What I've noticed more likely than not in the literature is unfortunately differences based on racial and ethnic makeup. And so it is important to note that the disparities that we see in healthcare really transcend and occur in this abuse reporting platform as well.
Great.
Yeah, I will highlight what Dr. Cinco said. Again, the cultural piece is really huge because the gender roles are also not only internally different, but there's disparities in how they're externally viewed depending on culture and whether it's normal behavior, quote unquote, normal for a given culture to respond in certain ways to sexual aggression or sexual action activities. So I don't have specific literature on it, I will admit, but it's there is plenty out there, and Laura and I would be happy to disseminate some.
Awesome. Two other quick questions came in. So one was, how might you approach a child who you suspect may have been traumatized? Should you, or should you let them come to you?
I'll go ahead and get started. Dr. Ortiz here. Yeah, this is a very, very hard one to answer. Again, I hate to be the person that's like skating it because I want to deliver information, so I'll do my best, but it is of course going to vary for every child in every circumstance. If a parent is concerned, or excuse me for saying parent, anybody is concerned that a child has experienced trauma, my advice here would be to seek outside guidance where you can actually disclose the specifics of what is concerning you. For example, as a pediatrician, when a parent or a family comes to me and I give the opportunity with the child outside of the room to talk to the parents or family, and they disclose something like, my child has suddenly started wetting the bed and or having abnormal play behaviors, and I'm concerned something has happened, what do I do? I will ask follow-up questions. What is the age of the child? Has the child indicated specific individuals that they are fearful of, or specific circumstances or clues to what might be going on? And actually, as a pediatrician, a healthcare provider, I'm sure Laura, others out there, those experts that are on our call right now, like psychologists, others, there are particular questions we go through, like who are the individuals in the home? Who cares for this child one-on-one? And we sort of help sift through that. So it's very hard for me to give a blanket statement. If a child discloses something to you, you absolutely should respond with the ways that Laura mentioned. But if you're concerned about something, it should definitely be raised to professionals. I think never just wait for a child to come to you would be the quick answer. Always do something, but it doesn't necessarily mean do something and talking to the child. It may be seeking professional help.
And I think it's also important to emphasize more in a preventative lens, but just when you're thinking about creating an environment where children might tell you, maybe if you don't notice these signs or these signs aren't being exhibited, I think it's really important to create an environment where the child knows that they are not going to get in trouble for saying these things if they come up, and that you care about them, and they are not to blame for their experiences. And so just really emphasizing that point also could just create an environment where children might come forward and tell you things. But like Dr. Ortiz said, if you do think that there is some scenario or some circumstance where this might be occurring, really getting professional one-on-one help and coaching in that will be, I think, the best way to approach it.
I think the summary is to do a little of both. It's perfect. Dr. Cinco, you mentioned that. I think creating that environment at home to allow a child to come forward while also seeking your own help.
Great. A couple other questions came in, and bear with me, I'm trying to synthesize these effectively. Is there anything you can do other than report if the grooming stage has started? Because the point being made is if you catch it early when you report, nothing necessarily physical happened, is in the quotes, but it makes it really challenging to potentially catch the perpetrator or the predator. Do you have any thoughts specifically on that front?
Laura, if you have anything, please jump in. I'm just going back to the support organizations because emphasizing that a lot of these organizations are not necessarily going to specifically have you report, but they can offer guidance on that. So calling these specific national organizations and making that exact description of I'm concerned about a grooming behavior, how do I intervene and what do I do, they can offer some advice. And it may not be that their organization is the expert, because I know there are psychological intervention organizations out there, for example, or family support dynamic organizations, and it's impossible to list them all, but you got to start somewhere, and these might help with that. They're not all definitely based on reporting. Just bring generalized concerns like that one that was raised excellently. Thank you for whoever raised that. To these organizations, and they will direct you where to go.
Yeah, and just to build up that's a really great question. And USA Gymnastics, their work with Safe Sport really creates a great avenue to raise some of these concerns. And even if you think you're in a situation where you have no evidence, putting things on the radar of these organizations are really important. I also think something you can do just with your children is just being able to, again, like I said previously, communicate the importance of boundaries and really sort of equip them with the knowledge and the skills that they might need just in general when they're talking to different peers or working with different adults. It's just like good behavior to be able to learn and sort of practice. How do you set your own boundaries, and how do you know that no matter what happens, it's not your fault? But again, I think since everything is so specific, it's always important to best go talk to these organizations and really give all the details so they can really sift through the nuances of these situations.
Yeah. 2 more questions, and then unless anybody has something else, we can plan to wrap up. So one question was made towards sort of, and I'm going to sort of synthesize this and generalize it for a broader audience, toward like training curriculum and how training curriculum for professionals can potentially be triggering. And I think that the question is really around that, for different individuals, clubs, coaches, judges, and other people, what options can be put in place to account for these things that could be triggering for the individuals that are going through them in some sort of training curriculum. And, from an R-Wave platform, we've done things like grounding exercises for this and disclaimers, letting people know what type of content. But I'd be curious to hear y'all's thoughts on this.
Laura, do you want to start? Do you have any specifics?
Sure. I can try. I've never really been involved in any sort of curriculum development when it comes to these things. It's a really hard balance because we know that training people and giving them the tools to really build a resilient community, as you very beautifully just pulled that slide up, Robin, is important. But recognizing we also need to be aware of our own personal boundaries and our own personal feelings around the topic. And so, yeah, I think that it's a really good point raised that there should probably be more reflective exercises, more grounding, more warnings, just in trainings in general. I think that is a helpful support that I think we might want to consider and should consider as we build some of these trainings. And so I think that that's a really valid thought. I also think we should have the right to recognize our own boundaries. And if we do need to step away from a training, I think that's something that we should have the right to do. And then talking to the administrative and trying to find some accommodations is always, I think, a good strategy. But this is, again, talking in generals because some things are mandatory and there's a lot of red tape with things like that. So my response is just that I hear you, and if this has happened to you, that must be really difficult. But I think there is something that it comes from a lot of angles. And so I think that, again, is like more of an individual basis.
Great.
Yeah, I echo what Dr. Cinco said. I think in order to create these resilient communities, so to speak, when we're going about trainings, there are ways to approach a training as trauma-informed. So SAMHSA, the organization that we use the structure of with the R's, the realize, recognize, etc., they actually have some information that's available to the public and downloadable. They're a government-run organization through Health and Human Services, and they provide some curricula for trauma-informed approaches to things in the professional environment or organization, so to speak. They may be a little bit too broad for what you're looking for within the sports community or trainings of leaders, but there are general principles about how to create a trauma-informed, supportive environment besides just the generals that we only could cover here today. So I would go to SAMHSA to start and build off of that. And I have had the honor of building a curriculum for physicians in training, pediatricians. And similarly, what we did is we started off with a basic, very small group discussion that gave permission for that, gave permission to say, we know that the vast majority, about 60 to 70% of the community has experienced a trauma in childhood. That's based off of the original ACEs study done in 1995. 98, by Folletti and colleagues. And we know that that means that one of us in this room has likely experienced something. So if anybody needs to leave, take a pause, come back to this in another way, please do so. To Laura's point, if things are mandatory, there are other ways to do that. Please reach out to me if you're interested in hearing about the curriculum that we've done. Again, not promoting or at all disclosing that here, just wanting to share that there are people out there doing these kinds of things and might have some advice depending on what you're looking for.
And Robin, do you mind going to the slide with all the R's? Someone just asked if they could see them all together.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually that will bring me past secondary trauma, which touches on that piece that when you're hearing and learning about how to be trauma informed, you may experience that. That's very valid. just to validate and hear the point of the individual that raised that. Sorry, I have to click a lot. So if we want to take another question in the meantime.
Yeah, we'll
The last one.
yeah, we'll duck over to that page so you can get a screenshot, and then we'll go back to the contact page just so you guys have all of our contact information, and then you know, obviously we'll work with USA Gymnastics and Safe Sport to send out that information. If you want to reach us directly, Laura and I's contact information is pretty simple. It's just Kyle or Laura at ourwave.org. And then Robin, do you want to just give a shout out? Because I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, of course. So I am providing a very unbiased Gmail address. The reason being I didn't want the feeling that this was associated with any organization. So I have a website, www.robinortiz.com. And the email that I use there is healthy2 and then the word question @gmail.com. And that way you can reach me without any organizational hoops. But again, I may only be able to respond to things that are not confidential.
Well, great. So yeah, whenever you get a sec, Robin, sorry to make you go all the way back down.
No, please, happy to. I can escape too and reorient.
Yeah, will you blast back down to the contact slide, just so that's sort of the last thing we leave everybody with. And generally what I would say is thank you all so much for taking part in this conversation. You know, if we have individual questions that I somehow missed reading through the tiny chat, please send them to us directly. We'd be happy to answer them and help in any way possible, you know, to the best of our abilities. Again, I'd like to thank Shelba and USA Gymnastics for having us. And ultimately, we just really appreciate all that you do for survivors and supporting those in your local communities. We can all make an impact in this category, and we can all do our part. So I'll hand it back to Shelba, but thanks again to everyone, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their week and stays sane on all these video calls.
Thank you, Kyle, Dr. Ortiz and Dr. Cinca. Oh my God, this was great. Thank you. We are, for everybody listening, we will be posting this onto our website, onto our YouTube channel, and then promoting it out again so you can then share it with your families, your parents of your gym, your staff. And I want to leave you with a couple of things. If you require, we do have waivers for what we call UN10 here at USA Gymnastics. That's the Center for Safe Sports course. If you can contact the Center for Safe Sport, or you can contact us, and then we will contact the Center for Safe Sport, and we'll make sure the wheels get rolling. There are waivers that can be put into motion by the center for that. So just make sure you contact one of us. And if you have a report to make, always contact the Center for Safe Sport or USA Gymnastics, and we'll make sure all reports get to the right place. And with that, I want to thank all of you guys so much. This was amazing. And I don't know what else to say, but thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone who's out there listening. Thank you to the organizations for having us.
Such a privilege. You guys have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right, bye.